The scent of my husband's cologne still clung to his tools when our sons began quietly dividing them like unspoken inheritance. Still I stood in the doorway, holding the letter he left only for his wife, not his heirs. As that scent thickened, it stopped smelling like memory and started smelling like a rasher. While my boys measured shelf space and called dibs on rifles, I reread his words. Let what I built serve someone who needs it. The same sons who skipped hospice now wanted keepsakes they never earned. That's when I turned to them and said, "You're already too late. It's all gone. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe." The funeral reception was quiet in that stiff, unnatural way only grief can make a room feel. Polite murmurs, the occasional glass clink, and the rustle of tissue against skin. Maggie sat on the edge of a long taupe love seat in the corner of the hall, a linen napkin clenched in her hand, wrinkled like old paper. She hadn't eaten, though 3 women had already tried to offer her plates of food she didn't want. Tuna salad, sliced ham, cupcakes with plastic toothpick crosses stabbed into the frosting. Next to her, Delia watched silently, offering the kind of presence only a lifelong friend could. No forced words, no reaching for silver linings, just stillness, shared. Maggie's eyes weren't on the mourners, they were on her sons. Andrew stood by the window, speaking in a voice just low enough to suggest privacy, and just careless enough to forget he was in earshot. "You take the tool shed," he said. "I'll handle the garage items." Bryce, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned in closer, flicking his wrist toward the far end of the backyard, as if already visualizing the layout. "Don't forget the rifles, they'll go quick." The words hit Maggie like a shot under the ribs. Her jaw tensed. The napkin in her hand tore silently down the middle. Delia turned her head. "Did he just say, 'They're picking at bones,'" Maggie said, voice low, eyes fixed. Delia didn't respond. She didn't have to. The weight of it said enough. Neither son had spoken directly to Maggie since the service ended. They'd hugged her in front of the casket, murmured the appropriate condolences with their hands awkwardly resting on her shoulder, and then drifted off into quiet corners with folded arms and pocketed phones. They hadn't asked how she was managing, hadn't offered help with the house, the bills, the weeds Hank used to pull from the driveway cracks every Saturday morning. Now, 20 feet away, they were dividing his possessions like they were claiming raffle prizes. Maggie stood. Delia touched her sleeve. "Mags." "I'm fine," Maggie said. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried a current. "I just need air." She walked past the dessert table and through a small group of neighbors who politely parted like curtains. She reached the edge of the room where her sons were still conferring. Bryce with his hands moving like a contractor drawing up plans. Andrew nodding as if approving a timeline. "You two are making plans already?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp and quiet. Both sons turned. Bryce straightened slightly. Andrew cleared his throat. "We weren't," Bryce began, but Maggie didn't let him finish. "I heard you," she said. "The tool shed, the garage, the rifles." Her eyes moved between them. "Was there a spreadsheet involved? Or are you just freelancing it?" Andrew raised his hands. "Mom, come on, we were just talking." "About what exactly?" Maggie asked. "What to grab before the ground's even filled in?" Andrew sighed. "We're not trying to be disrespectful. You've got a whole property to manage now. We figured we'd—" "Take things off my plate," Maggie said, biting off the last word. "That's what you mean, right?" "We thought it'd help," Bryce said, his tone tight but rehearsed. "Dad had a lot of stuff." "Yes," Maggie said. "He did. He had a lot of stuff. Most of which he cared about, some of which he built, and all of which he kept organized because he didn't want anyone else messing with it." Andrew shifted his stance. "We're not robbing the place, Mom." "You think that's the problem?" she said, voice rising slightly. "You think this is about inventory management." The room behind them was quieter now. People were watching. Maggie didn't care. "For 6 months I watched your father disappear in pieces. He couldn't dress himself by the end. Couldn't finish a sentence. I wiped food from his chin like he was a child. And do you know what he said to me the night before he stopped talking entirely?" Neither son spoke. He said, "I'm sorry I left you alone with this. and he was still alive. Andrew looked down at the floor. Bryce clenched his jaw, eyes blinking fast. Maggie's voice softened but didn't lose its edge. You didn't call. You didn't come. And now, instead of asking me what I need, you're busy sorting through bolts and measuring for wall space. We didn't mean to hurt you, Bryce said, his voice sounding younger than it should have. I know you didn't, she replied. But you did, and that matters more. Andrew stepped forward. We'll hold off. Whatever you want, Mom. I want you to remember who he was, she said, not just what he left behind. Neither argued. There was no apology, no big scene, just two sons who suddenly remembered how to stand still. Maggie walked back to her seat. Delia met her with a look of quiet admiration, but didn't say a word. The room moved on. People returned to their stories, their paper cups of cider, their murmured condolences. Outside the tall windows, the leaves had begun to fall, gold and orange spinning downward in slow spirals, like a season shedding its skin. The house was silent again. That night, after the last casserole dish was dropped off and the last condolences had been murmured, Maggie stood in the doorway of Hank's study. The overhead bulb hummed faintly, casting soft gold light over the old wooden desk and the worn leather chair no one else had ever really sat in. His slippers were still by the corner, angled just so, like he might be coming back in a minute. She hadn't touched this room in days. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the latch clicking like a period at the end of a sentence. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. The scent of Hank when he was still strong enough to fix the dryer himself, when he'd curse at stripped screws and sing old country lyrics under his breath. Maggie sat down, fingers brushing along the desk's edge until they found the envelope. She hadn't noticed it before, tucked beneath the black leather blotter like a secret waiting its turn. Her name was written on the front in Hank's uneven handwriting, soft and slanted, the letters shaky from the months the disease had stolen from him. But it was still his, still Hank. She opened it slowly, carefully, like it might dissolve if she moved too fast. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal paper, the lines faint under the faded ink. Maggie, if you're reading this, I guess I'm not giving speeches at my own funeral after all. Please don't let them fight, not over my stuff. It's not worth it. Let what I owned serve someone else, not tear this family apart. I didn't build a garage full of memories just to watch it turned into a battleground. Give it all away if you have to. Just no division, not over things. I love you. I trust you. You'll know what's right. H. She read it 3 times. The first time, she cried. Silent tears that slipped down her face and dropped onto the envelope in her lap. The second time, she let out a long, shaking breath. The third, she folded it carefully, smoothed the creases, and tucked it back into the envelope like a promise. Then she stood up. The next morning, the sky was a pale gray over the hill, and the leaves outside shivered in a crisp wind as Maggie dialed the number from memory. Will Hardy picked up on the 3rd ring. Will, she said, voice steady, I need to move quickly and quietly. Will was slow to speak, like he already understood what was coming. Want to donate it all? Every damn piece, Maggie said. Tools, furniture, rifles. If it's in the house or shed or garage, it goes. There was a pause. Not hesitation, just respect. You got it, Will said. I know just who to call. By noon, a list was forming. Shelters, veteran centers, churches, trade schools. People who could use things, not hoard them, not argue over them. Use them. Delia came by just after lunch, holding 2 coffees and a skeptical brow. You sure about this? Maggie was standing at the edge of the garage, her arms crossed. The metal door rolled open behind her. Inside, the afternoon light caught on the polished handles of Hank's tools. Wrenches lined up like soldiers. A vice grip still bolted to the bench. She hadn't let anyone touch it until now. I'm sure, Maggie said. Delia walked beside her, handing her a coffee. You're not worried what they'll say? They're not fighting over his stuff, Maggie said. They're fighting over a ghost. She took a sip, her jaw set. Behind her, she heard a car pull into the gravel. A soft crunch under slow-moving tires. Maggie turned. It wasn't Will, it was Andrew. He stepped out slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. Behind him, the back seat was folded down. There were boxes in the trunk. He stopped when he saw the open garage, and the two men already inside, carefully unhooking the power tools and folding tarps. His face tightened. "Maggie," Delia said quietly, "you want me to stay?" Maggie didn't answer. She set the coffee down on the hood of the car and stepped forward. Andrew stood still, one hand resting on the back of his neck, the other loosely hanging at his side. His eyes moved between Maggie and the two men inside the garage, now carefully unscrewing wall brackets from Hank's custom tool rack. The sound of ratchets turning echoed faintly in the cool morning air. "Mom," he said, walking a few steps forward. "Can we just talk for a minute?" Maggie didn't look up. She was watching the men wrap duct tape around the legs of an old workbench. It was stained with oil, notches cut into the edge where Hank had carved measurements over the years. Her jaw was tight, but her shoulders were relaxed, not defiant, just certain. Andrew tried again. "I just think before anything gets taken out, we should sit down. Me, Bryce, you, go over things properly." Maggie turned then, slowly. "You want a meeting?" Andrew nodded. "I want us all on the same page." Her eyes scanned him, not with anger, but with the tired clarity that only comes after months of carrying something heavier than grief. "Give me a week," she said. "1 week of no questions, no lists, no sit-downs." Andrew hesitated. "Okay," he said finally, voice lower now. 1 week." He glanced once more toward the garage, the boxes lined up along the driveway, the labeled tape strips catching the sun. Then he turned back to his car, shut the trunk quietly, and drove away without another word. By the next morning, Maggie was in jeans, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, and her late mother's scarf tying back her hair. She was up before sunrise. The kettle clicked off before it finished boiling. There was too much to do to wait on steam. Delia arrived by 8:10, coffee in one hand, a yellow legal pad in the other. She didn't bother knocking, just walked in like always, kicked her shoes off at the door, and surveyed the living room. "We doing this in order of least sentimental to most emotionally devastating?" she asked, sipping. "We start upstairs," Maggie said, already halfway up the steps. The first room they tackled was the guest room, mostly untouched since Hank's cousin stayed the night 2 summers ago. Extra linens, books, a desk lamp with a frayed cord. Everything was either boxed or donated within an hour. Delia wrote everything down, page after page of makeshift inventory, half of it annotated in her own sarcastic shorthand. The attic came next. There, under yellow insulation and brittle cobwebs, they found crates of Hank's old vocational teaching materials, carpentry textbooks, handmade tool mock-ups, and a miniature wooden staircase model with tiny dovetail joints. Maggie didn't linger. She wiped the dust from the covers and packed them neatly. They paused only once that day, sitting on the porch steps, sipping water while the wind stirred leaves across the lawn. Delia reached out, brushing a pine needle from Maggie's shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm doing what needs to be done," Maggie said. "That's enough for now." By Thursday, the entire upstairs had been sorted. The keep pile fit in a single linen closet. Everything else was taped, labeled, and stacked against the dining room wall. Downstairs, Maggie moved slower, not from fatigue, but from care. Every drawer, every shelf in the living room, kitchen, and Hank's study was examined. The house no longer felt like a shrine. It felt like a place in transition. On Friday morning, Maggie made 2 calls. The first was to a hospice thrift store in nearby Oakhurst that provided care equipment for underfunded families. The second, a veterans outreach program that ran workshops for trades training and housing support. She offered tools, furniture, books, blankets, whatever could serve. They both said yes, fast. That afternoon, Will Hardy pulled up in his beat-up Silverado, clipboard under one arm. His jeans were dusty, shirt untucked, boots leaving fine prints in the gravel as he walked to the porch. "I got the donation release forms here," he said. "You ready?" Maggie took the clipboard, flipped through the pages, then signed her name with quiet resolve. "You sure you're okay with all this going out?" Will asked. "I'm doing what Hank asked," Maggie said. He didn't want the things. He wanted the meaning behind them to go on. Will nodded, not pressing further. "I'll send the truck by next week." That night after Delia left, Maggie walked through the house alone. It was quiet, but not the tense, breath-holding silence it had been since the funeral. This was a different kind of quiet, spacious, honest. The walls weren't full anymore, but the weight had lifted. Rooms echoed. The air felt clearer. She opened windows and let the breeze in. She stood in the middle of the living room and listened to nothing, not clocks ticking, not memories shouting, just stillness. Maggie stood at the center of the bedroom, hands on her hips, her eyes fixed on the garment bag hanging from the back of the closet door. The house had grown emptier, lighter, but this piece, this one item, had waited. Not forgotten, reserved. She slid the zipper down slowly. Inside, preserved in near-perfect condition, was Hank's navy dress uniform, pressed, clean, the brass buttons still shining with the polish he'd insisted on using before every ceremony. The uniform had outlasted the man. Maggie lifted it off the hanger with care, holding it by the shoulders the way he used to stand when she helped him straighten the lapels. The weight of it was heavier than it looked. Not just fabric and thread, but 30 years of service stitched into every seam. Promotions, transfers. The time he came home early and didn't tell her, just walked through the kitchen door and scared her half to death before laughing so hard he cried. She laid the uniform across the bed, smoothing the fabric once with both hands. Then she folded it gently, sleeves tucked in, collar crisp, and placed it into a clean archival box with white tissue paper layered beneath it. Delia arrived just as she was sealing the lid. "You're not shipping that with the others, are you?" Delia asked, leaning against the door frame, coffee in hand, barefoot as always. "No," Maggie said. "This one's going to the Veterans Archive in Albany, for display." Delia raised her brows. "Display?" "They take select pieces for preservation, honorable discharge, combat insignia, officer class. It qualifies." Delia whistled softly. "You sure they'll accept it?" Maggie nodded. "Already spoke to them. There's a form to submit with it. Short bio, service dates, and a dedication." She stepped to the desk and uncapped a blue pen. Her handwriting was steady as she filled in the required fields. Name of service member: Henry Thomas Vance Rank, Lieutenant Commander Branch, U.S. Navy Years of Service, 1984-2014 dedication. Text: worn by a man who owed no one anything. Delia came to stand behind her, reading over her shoulder. "That's the classiest middle finger I've ever seen," she said. Maggie smiled faintly. "They want pieces. I want purpose." She picked up her phone and snapped a photo of the folded uniform in the box. Just one. She looked at it for a moment. Something about the way the navy blue contrasted with the soft white tissue. Then she pressed and held the screen. "Delete photo?" She tapped yes. Delia watched, then nodded once, like she understood. The rest of the afternoon moved like clockwork. Maggie packed 3 more boxes, 2 with small tools and household items, 1 with Hank's books, all bound for the nonprofits. She labeled each one carefully, handwriting neat and exact. For donation, do not return. As twilight filtered in through the window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, Maggie taped the final box shut and stood back, hands on her lower back, exhaling slowly. "I'll drop these at the Post Depot tonight," she said. "The uniform box ships separately. Priority. I already scheduled it." Delia glanced at her watch. "You're doing all this before the boys even get their precious sit-down." Maggie didn't respond immediately. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the hall closet, placing the pen back in its holder. Everything had a place again, or at least the right things did. "They think I'm stalling," she said at last, dragging my feet, sorting through memories to delay decisions. "Aren't you?" Delia asked. "No," Maggie said. "I'm setting the terms." She flicked off the kitchen light and turned back to the front room, where the uniform box sat near the door, waiting for morning. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen blinds in long, even stripes across the table. Maggie sat there with a cup of coffee gone cold, the donation receipt folded neatly beside it. The ink was still fresh, her signature at the bottom. Will Hardy's initials confirming pickup. She'd made sure to get copies, 1 for the records, 1 for the Veterans Network, and 1 for herself. The paper smelled faintly of toner and finality. By noon, Both of her sons were pulling into the gravel drive. Andrew first, Bryce right behind him, his truck louder than the moment called for. Maggie didn't flinch. She just waited by the porch railing, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan. They got out almost in unison, both wearing that brittle calm that always came before a fight they thought they could win. Andrew spoke first. "Mom, we need to talk." "I figured you would," Maggie said. "Come inside." The living room looked different now, echoing slightly, stripped of the clutter that once softened its corners. The boxes were gone. The air felt unburdened. Bryce looked around like he'd stepped into someone else's home. "Where's everything?" "Gone," Maggie said simply. He frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, everything's already gone," she said. "Donated, distributed, out of this house." Andrew blinked, processing, his tone hardening. "You donated it? Without asking us?" "I didn't need permission," Maggie said, steady as a plumb line. "I had his wishes," Bryce scoffed. "His wishes? He didn't mean—" "He meant exactly that," she interrupted. "His letter said, 'Let what I owned serve someone else.' That's what I did." Andrew stepped forward. "You had no right to—" "I had every right," Maggie said, voice sharp now. "He left everything to me. Not because he didn't trust you, but because he knew how quickly you'd turn his life into a checklist." The silence that followed was heavy. Bryce paced once, raking his hand through his hair. Andrew crossed his arms. "This isn't just about tools, Mom," Andrew said. "There were things of sentimental value, family things." "Then you should have shown some sentiment while he was still breathing," she said quietly. Bryce looked stung. "That's not fair." "No," Maggie said, her voice softer. "It's not, but it's true." They stood there in the quiet, the three of them, until a knock came at the door. Will Hardy stepped in, hat in hand, papers under his arm. "Afternoon," he said. "Thought I'd drop this off before heading back." Andrew turned. "You're the guy who handled the donations." Will nodded once. "That's right," Andrew's jaw set. "You realize some of that stuff was supposed to be ours." Will glanced at Maggie, then back to him. "You're not heirs to his shed. Or his wrenches. Your mother had full authority, and she used it lawfully. I made sure every item went where it could do real good." Bryce muttered something under his breath. Will ignored it. "I've been around long enough to know what folks leave behind. Tools rust, wood splits. People, they're what matters. Your dad knew that." Andrew's face reddened. "We're not after money. We just wanted—" "Control," Maggie said. He turned sharply toward her. "Respect. You earn that by understanding the man you lost," she said, "not by inventorying what he left." Bryce opened his mouth to speak, but Will gently stepped back, hand on the doorknob. "I'll leave you folks to it. Maggie, I'll email the tax copies tonight." She nodded. "Thank you, Will." When the door shut behind him, the air thinned. The brothers stood in the center of the now bare living room, eyes darting toward the empty walls like they were looking for proof of something that no longer existed. Finally, Andrew said, "We'll be talking to someone about this." "Call whoever you want," Maggie said, picking up the receipt from the coffee table. "The law's on my side, but more importantly, so is Hank." She held the paper for a moment, then set it down gently, smoothing the creases flat with her palm. Bryce looked at his brother, then at her, his expression softening just slightly. "You didn't have to cut us out completely, Mom." "I didn't," she said. "You did that yourselves." He had no reply. They left together, no door slam, no raised voices. Just the faint crunch of gravel fading into distance. Maggie exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling just once before they steadied. The house was silent again, but not lonely. She poured herself a glass of wine, red, dry, the kind Hank never liked, and sat at the kitchen table. The roast chicken she'd made earlier was cooling beside her. She ate in small bites, unhurried, methodical. It was her first dinner alone in over a week, and for the first time, it tasted clean. The envelope came certified. Will Hardy stood in Maggie's doorway, a manila folder tucked under his arm and a faint smirk resting at the corners of his mouth. His boots were still dusty from a morning job. He didn't need to say anything. Maggie already knew. "They actually filed it?" she asked, holding the screen door open. Will stepped inside, nodding. "Filed and dismissed, in less than 2 days." He handed her the folder. Inside was a photocopy of the court order, petition for emergency estate stay, denied. The judge's notes were brief and unceremonious. The estate had been properly executed. All assets legally transferred. Nothing remained to contest. Every item's already been logged, donated, or rehomed, Will said. There's nothing left to pause. I attached receipts. Even sent the Veterans Center a notarized inventory. They didn't have a leg to stand on. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So that's it? That's it. She closed the folder and placed it on the kitchen counter, not triumphant, just relieved. Thanks, Will. Happy to see justice move faster than ego for once. He left with the tip of his hat, and Maggie didn't bother watching his truck pull away. Instead, she grabbed her gloves from the back porch bench and headed outside. The sun was high, warm but not punishing. The garden beds along the fence were wild from weeks of neglect. Tomato vines crawling over themselves, rosemary bushes reaching out like stubborn hands. Maggie crouched by the roots of a sagging cucumber plant and started cutting back the overgrowth. She didn't think about Andrew. She didn't think about Bryce. She thought about Hank, bent over this same dirt year after year, his fingers calloused from more than just tools. He used to say a man's soul showed up in the way he watered what couldn't speak back. She wiped her brow, dug deeper into the soil, and didn't notice Delia walking up the back path until the screen door creaked open. I come bearing sugar, Delia announced, holding up a ceramic dish covered with foil. Peach cobbler, still warm. Maggie stood, brushing dirt from her knees. You trying to make me fat? No, Delia said. Just trying to feed a woman who just buried a petition with the same grace she buried her husband's belt sander. They sat on the back steps, knees brushing, the cobbler steaming between them. Delia spooned the first bite. Feels like a win. Maggie didn't respond right away. She watched a squirrel dart across the fence line, startled by its own shadow. It's not about winning, she said finally. It's about not losing what he stood for. Delia nodded slowly. I know. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of quiet that meant more than any toast. Inside, Maggie's phone buzzed once. She didn't check it right away. It could wait. Everything could wait now. When she finally did look, the message was short. No greeting, no sign-off. Just Andrew's name and 7 words. You've made yourself very clear. Maggie stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it and set it face down on the porch rail. She didn't cry. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt was distance, not the kind that stretched miles, but the kind that settled like cooled lava between people who used to speak in shorthand and now only knew each other in legalese. She looked back out at the garden, a section where the peppers had failed to sprout. She'd replant. She always did. It was late afternoon when Bryce showed up, unannounced. The gravel didn't crunch the same way Andrew's tires did. Bryce always pulled in faster, less cautiously, like everything could be handled once he was inside. Maggie was on her knees in the garden again, sweat blooming across her collarbone. She didn't look up when she heard the truck door slam. He stood near the gate for a few seconds, unsure whether to call out or wait. When she didn't rise, he made the first move. You humiliated us. Maggie clipped a dead leaf from the tomato vine, then set the shears down beside her. No, she said, rising slowly. You did that yourselves. Bryce walked closer, hands jammed in his jacket pockets, tension riding in his shoulders. You made it public, that we weren't in the loop, that we didn't matter. You filed a petition against your father's wishes, she said evenly. I didn't make that public. The county clerk did. He looked at her like he wanted to argue, but he didn't have the breath for it. I know we didn't show up the way we should have, he said finally. And I know we didn't say the right things, but we're not monsters, Mom. We just wanted pieces of him. Maggie's jaw tensed. She looked toward the garden where the cucumbers had started climbing again, new tendrils curling toward the trellis she and Hank had built 3 summers ago. Then you should have acted like you remembered him, she said. Bryce stepped back like he'd been slapped. That's not fair, she turned toward him, eyes sharp but not cruel. He wasn't perfect, Bryce. God knows he had his temper. But he was loyal, and he paid attention. And when he started fading, I was the one holding the pieces. So no, you don't get to act surprised that I honored what he wrote down instead of what you remembered too late. She walked to the edge of the porch, opened the screen door, and stepped inside. Bryce hesitated, then followed. She didn't offer him a seat, just moved to the bookshelf and pulled a slim envelope from the drawer, the original. Not the scanned copy. Not the one she'd filed with the estate forms. This was Hank's letter in his own handwriting, still creased where she'd unfolded it too many times to count. Without ceremony, she handed it to him. Bryce took it with both hands, like it was fragile. He stared at the envelope, then opened it and read silently. His eyes moved slow, deliberate. No flinching, no disbelief, just the words and the weight of them. He read it twice. When he was done, he didn't hand it back. He held it for a moment longer, as if some part of him thought it might start speaking again. Then he folded it neatly, set it down on the entry table, and stepped back. "He really wrote that?" Bryce asked quietly. "Yes," Maggie said. "I guess we were too late," he said, not accusing, just honest. She didn't respond. There was nothing else to say. Bryce lingered a beat, looked around the quiet of the house. The walls were still bare. Hank's boots were no longer by the door. The house looked smaller without the weight of memory cluttering its corners. "I thought coming here would help," he said, more to himself than to her. "But it just makes it worse." "You came to be heard," Maggie said. "Now you have been." He nodded once. At the door, his hand hovered over the knob before he finally turned it. "Tell Delia I'm not mad about the cobbler comment," he said, almost smiling. "She's not wrong." "She rarely is," Maggie replied. He left without another word. Maggie stood alone in the living room, the letter back on the table, her own hands at her sides. She stared at the closed door for a moment, then reached over and picked up the envelope. She slipped it back into the drawer without rereading it. Outside, the wind shifted, and the smell of rosemary and sun-warmed soil drifted through the open kitchen window. The first scratch showed up on the side of the garage door, deep, jagged, and fresh. Maggie noticed it while locking up late one evening, just as the porch light clicked on behind her. The second came the next day. A toppled planter near the gate. The clay cracked in two, its rosemary spilling across the mulch like a body flung sideways. By the third, a long gouge across her mailbox, clear as a signature. Maggie stopped wondering if it was coincidence. She didn't react, not publicly, not to the neighbors, not to Delia, not even to herself. But she documented every mark. She started a folder in the kitchen drawer, same place she kept the donation receipts and court documents. She snapped photos, wrote dates, circled damage with a red pen like a teacher grading a careless test. When Delia stopped by and saw the split planter, she raised a brow. "What the hell happened here?" Maggie pointed. "Same thing that happened to the garage." Delia followed her around the side of the house, took one look at the scratches, and exhaled hard. "Boys who don't get toys act like toddlers." Maggie didn't laugh. She crouched, inspected the gravel like it might offer a footprint, then stood again. Delia crossed her arms. "You want me to handle it?" "No," Maggie said, "but I want to make sure they can't handle me." That weekend, Will came by with a set of updated documents in a heavy leather folder. "Revised protections," he said, flipping through them. "Locking the house under a limited homestead trust. Assets frozen under your name only. I flagged it with the county records, so if anyone tries to contest it again, they'll have to go through me first, and it won't be quiet." Maggie signed every page without hesitation. He paused before leaving. "You sure you don't want to press charges? We could—" "Not yet," she said. "But I want paper on every incident. Official." He nodded. "Understood." That night, she and Delia unboxed the camera system Maggie had ordered online. 6 discrete units with night vision, motion sensors, and automatic cloud backup. Delia poured herself a glass of wine and unwrapped the mounts, while Maggie read the installation manual with military precision. They worked until well after dark, Maggie on the ladder, Delia holding steady from below. "You know," Delia said, tightening a bracket under the porch roof. "You could have just gotten a dog." Maggie didn't smile. Dogs forgive too easily. By midnight, every corner of the house had an unblinking eye. The cameras synced to her phone. The lights outside were set to trigger with movement. And the garden, which had once held silence and grief, now held something else entirely: vigilance. 3 days later, the notification came at 2:37 a.m. Maggie was awake. She hadn't been sleeping well, not from fear, but from habit. The bed still felt uneven without Hank beside her, like the mattress hadn't quite accepted the change. She checked the app and watched the grainy footage on her phone. Bryce, alone. He stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, hood pulled low. He didn't come all the way to the porch, didn't knock, just stood for a while in the dark, like he couldn't quite make himself leave or stay. Then he walked toward the garden. The footage jumped once. When it came back, the basil plant was kicked over, its container lying cracked by the path. He left quietly, no damage beyond the plant, no words, just the gesture, small, pointless, sad. The next morning, Maggie printed the screenshot and added it to her folder. She drove it down to the station and filed a non-emergency report with Officer Daniels, a man whose mustache hadn't changed since Reagan. "Pressing charges?" he asked. "No," Maggie said, sliding the print across the counter. "Just documenting." He looked at her like he wasn't sure what to make of that. "Let me know if it escalates," he said. "I don't expect it to," Maggie replied, standing. He already knows where the line is. Now he knows I do too. She walked out into the parking lot, keys in hand, the morning sun bright but not warm. It started with a thank you note, typed, folded cleanly, delivered by mail and signed by hand. The seal on the envelope bore the insignia of the State Veterans Network. Maggie had to read it twice to believe it wasn't a request or a form or some posthumous correction to paperwork. It simply read, "On behalf of every family who now has access to better tools, warmer homes, and dignity. Thank you, Mrs. Vance. What you gave wasn't inventory. It was legacy." 3 days later, a call came. The Veterans Group in Albany was holding its annual fundraiser. A representative named Carla explained that word had spread quickly about Hank's full donation. Not just the uniform, but the power tools, the books, the workbench that now sat in a learning center for disabled vets, trying to build back their independence. "We'd love it if you could say a few words," Carla said. "Nothing long, just a story, something about Hank." Maggie sat at the kitchen table, the phone pressed between her cheek and shoulder, her hands folded around her coffee. "He wasn't the kind of man who liked stages," she said. "He believed in helping quietly." There was a pause on the line. Carla waited. "So do I," Maggie added. Carla didn't argue. She only said, "Then if you'd like to send a letter, we'd be honored to read it aloud on your behalf." Maggie agreed. 2 nights later, she wrote the letter in longhand, folding the page carefully before slipping it into an envelope with her return address in the top left corner, just like Hank used to insist. He didn't serve because someone asked. He served because he believed hands were made to build, tools were made to teach, and that the best kind of help was the kind you didn't announce. I thank you for allowing his memory to keep working. The following Saturday, Maggie stood in line at the local post office, behind a man mailing his granddaughter a plush duck and a woman returning boots she'd never worn. When she reached the front, she paid in cash and watched as the letter disappeared behind the metal slot. She didn't need a tracking number. She already knew it would land where it was supposed to. Later that week, Chloe stopped by. She was 13 now, tall, curious, the kind of teenager who asked hard questions but listened to the answers. The civics teacher had assigned a project on unsung contributions in the community. Most kids chose war memorials or town founders. Chloe chose Maggie. Delia brought her over, unannounced but smiling. "She's got to interview someone who's made a local impact," Delia explained, leaning against the door frame with her hands in her coat pockets, "and someone who didn't ask for attention doing it." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "That narrows the field." Chloe spoke up. "You donated your husband's whole shop to people who actually use it. That's real. That's not just charity. It's civic duty." Maggie blinked, taken aback, not by the facts, but by the tone. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't performance. It was observation. She nodded once. "All right then. Come by next week. Bring good questions. No softballs." Chloe grinned, already pulling out a notepad. After they left, Delia lingered on the porch while Maggie watered the rosemary near the kitchen steps. "You smiled," Delia said, arms folded, voice low. Maggie looked up, surprised. Delia grinned. "Don't try to deny it. First time in weeks, maybe longer. Maggie set the watering can down and wiped her hands on her jeans. Guess I forgot how. They stood there for a moment, both women watching the sky shift toward dusk. Pale lavender clouds drifted slow over the tree line. Delia's voice softened. You know, your boys missed the best parts of you. Maggie didn't respond right away. She looked toward the garden. The basil had been replanted, the planter repaired. The cameras still blinked quietly above the porch. She turned back to Delia. Then I guess I'm finally getting them back. They called from the paper on a Wednesday. A woman named Jenna, local reporter, said she was working on a profile piece about civic generosity in small towns. Maggie had been recommended by someone at the Veterans Group in Albany. The fundraiser letter had apparently made the rounds. I'd love to set up an in-person interview, Jenna said brightly. We think this could be a really inspiring story for Veterans Day. Maggie was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the kitchen counter. The afternoon light poured in through the window, warm and unassuming. No interviews, she said. Jenna hesitated. Okay. Would you consider answering a few questions by email? A short written feature? That's fine, Maggie said. Just don't make it more than it was. Jenna promised she wouldn't. Maggie knew better than to believe that entirely. The piece ran the following Sunday. Widow donates everything, fulfills final wish of decorated veteran. There was no photo of Maggie, just a black and white image of Hank's folded uniform on display, his nameplate polished and visible under the glass. The story described his Navy service, the donations, the vocational school, now bearing a plaque in his name. It mentioned Maggie's letter and her refusal to speak publicly. A quiet widow honoring a quiet man. The comments online were overwhelmingly kind. People from neighboring counties wrote in, "This is what honor looks like. God bless this woman. My brother was in that program. He's using one of those toolboxes right now." Strangers mailed thank you cards to the town hall, unsure where she lived, hoping someone would forward them. One envelope contained a $20 bill and a note that read, "Buy yourself lunch. You did something good." Maggie kept the card, donated the bill. 3 days later, a text came in. It was Bryce. "Really classy of you. Must have felt good." No greeting, no emoji, just enough cold in the phrasing to sting. Maggie read it once, then again. She typed her reply slowly, each word chosen with care. It didn't feel good, it felt like him. She hit send. No response came. She didn't expect one. That evening, Maggie walked out to the garage. The walls were emptier now, just a few spare tools and a box of gardening gear in the corner. But the light still fell the same through the high window, long golden beams catching dust in the air, the same way it always had when Hank was alive and elbow deep in a project. She opened the manila envelope Jenna had sent by mail and pulled out the newsprint. The story was folded in thirds. She smoothed it flat on the workbench, her hand lingering briefly on Hank's name. It wasn't vanity that made her frame it. It wasn't pride. It was record-keeping. Hank's name had once been sewn into his uniform, stamped into his dog tags, embossed on paperwork now locked in file drawers. But here, in the grain of newsprint, surrounded by verbs like gave, honored, and served, it lived in public. Maggie found an old wood frame in the hall closet, cleaned the glass, and mounted the article with the same precision she used to reserve for folding laundry and balancing checkbooks. She drove one nail into the wall above the workbench, just high enough not to be eye level, not a monument, just a reminder. She stepped back and looked at it. There was no rush of pride, no swell of validation. But her shoulders eased. For the first time in months, the garage didn't feel like a hollowed-out battlefield. It felt like what it had once been, a space where things got fixed, built, restored. She left the light on when she closed the door. It was a gray morning, the kind that carried no promises, not of rain, not of sun, just the soft kind of light that made everything look a little faded. Maggie was sweeping the porch when she saw a car she didn't recognize at first. It wasn't the truck. It wasn't loud. It rolled in quietly, slow enough to show respect to the gravel. Andrew stepped out. He looked thinner, or maybe just worn. His shirt was tucked in too neatly, as if he'd tried to put himself together but hadn't quite managed the inside part. The circles under his eyes were darker than she remembered. Maggie didn't move to greet him. She leaned the broom against the railing and waited. He took off his sunglasses and shoved them into his jacket pocket. "Can I come in?" "Porch is fine," she said. He nodded, like he'd expected that. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze pushed through the chimes by the window, a hollow metallic sound that used to drive Hank crazy. Now it was just background. "I was wrong," Andrew said finally. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "About what?" He looked down at his hands. "About all of it. The garage, the tools, the fight." She didn't answer. The silence stayed between them like a deliberate pause in a long conversation neither wanted to finish. "I treated his things like they were mine," he said. "No," Maggie said. "You treated him like a transaction." Andrew's throat worked, a muscle twitching just beneath his jaw. "Yeah," he said. "That's fair." He sat down on the porch step, elbows on his knees, and stared out at the yard. The soil had been turned recently, rows of new sprouts pushing up where the cucumbers used to be. Maggie had replanted. She always did. He let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh. "You know, when Dad got sick, I told myself I'd handle it better than Bryce. Be the level-headed one, responsible. But I just kept my distance. Pretended being busy was the same as being brave." Maggie's voice softened. "It's easier to measure worth in things you can touch." Andrew nodded slowly. "Yeah, until you realize you can't hold the one thing that mattered." They sat in quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that wasn't strained, just unsteady, like something learning to breathe again. A crow cawed from the far side of the fence. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Life moved on, indifferent and ordinary. Andrew looked up at her finally. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reminding me who he was." Maggie's fingers tightened around the railing, the wood warm beneath her palm. She wanted to say something sharp, or comforting, or both. But the words that came out were simple. He'd have liked to hear that. Andrew smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He probably would have just told me to get back to work. "That too," Maggie said, and a faint laugh escaped before she could stop it. He stood then, wiping his hands on his jeans like he used to when he was a boy coming in from the yard. "Listen, I know there's no fixing everything. I just wanted you to know I get it now." Maggie nodded once. "You can visit," she said quietly. "Just don't bring expectations." Andrew took that in. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't exile either. It was something in between, honest, conditional, alive. "I won't," he said. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The space between them didn't feel hostile anymore, just wide, like a bridge under construction. When he left, the car rolled down the drive without kicking up dust. Maggie stood there until the sound faded. Then she picked up the broom again and swept the same patch of porch she'd already cleared. It wasn't about the dust. It was about keeping what was clean, clean. The form was simple. Name of award, funding source, distribution method. A few checkboxes, a signature line, a mailing address for disbursements. Maggie filled it out at the kitchen table in pen, not online. She still didn't trust forms that disappeared when you hit the wrong key. This one would go by mail, on real paper. In an envelope she sealed with the edge of a wet sponge, the way Hank used to. The name came easily, the Hank Caldwell Quiet Service Award. It would be offered annually to a student at the local vocational school who demonstrated what Maggie called useful kindness. Not showy, not rewarded, just consistent. The kind of student who stayed late to clean the shop floor, who helped someone else understand the measuring tape without rolling their eyes. Maggie didn't set up a trust. She didn't make it a foundation. She used a modest annuity Hank had started years ago, meant for odds and ends after retirement. There was no fanfare, no press. She told no one except Delia and Will Hardy. And eventually, Bryce found out. Not from her, not from any announcement. He must have heard it through someone at the school, or maybe saw the name listed on a newsletter. Either way, the text came at 9:41 p.m., just as Maggie was folding towels in the laundry room, so you still had money to spare. Good to know, no greeting, no punctuation. Just a little jab, the kind meant to draw blood without breaking skin. Maggie stared at it for a moment, then she hit delete. Not block, not reply, just erase. Some things didn't deserve a shelf in her memory. The next morning, Delia showed up with a swatch book and a thermos of coffee. Curtain mission, she declared, dropping both onto the kitchen table. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Is this a thing now? Delia popped open the thermos. It is. You've got old ones in every room, heavy, beige, and full of secrets. Time to get something new. They walked the house slowly, room to room, holding up fabric against the morning light. Deep greens, muted blues, a linen sheer with tiny embroidered stitches. Maggie surprised herself by leaning toward color, nothing loud, just alive. In the living room, Delia stood back, arms folded, watching Maggie hold up a slate blue panel. It's a new house now, Delia said. Maggie shook her head. No, it's the same one. She took a step back, smoothing the curtain against the frame. I just cleaned it. Delia smiled softly, but didn't argue. That afternoon, Maggie stood in the doorway of the garage. The framed article still hung over the workbench, dusted weakly. Below it sat a box of rags, some spare screws, a half-full tin of wood stain. No clutter, no hoarding, just tools that still served a purpose. She thought about what Hank would say, if he could see it all now. Probably something dry, like, took you long enough to clear this place. But he'd mean it with pride. The screen door creaked behind her. Delia stood with 2 iced teas, both sweating in the heat. You ever think about selling? Delia asked, handing one over. Maggie sipped before answering. Sometimes. And she looked around the garage. The light, the air, the space. And then I remember, she said. You can't sell the work someone left behind. You just take care of it. They stood there a while, watching the shadows shift across the floor. Maggie sat at the dining room table with a pen in hand, her glasses low on her nose, and a yellow legal pad covered in tidy handwriting. One column listed bank accounts, another listed disbursements, property taxes prepaid, insurance premiums locked in for the next 5 years. The third was titled simply, No Access. Every account had been transferred to new titles. The house, officially protected under the Homestead Trust Will had set up. The annuity used for Hank's award was closed and fully endowed. Maggie's name stood alone on every document. There were no co-signers, no inheritors, no cracks. Will sat across from her, flipping through the final set of papers. Initials scribbled at the corners, his pen cap balanced between his teeth. You're fully insulated now, he said, signing one last form. If either of them tries to challenge anything again, it won't just be futile, it'll be embarrassing. Maggie didn't smile, but something in her shoulders dropped, just slightly. Let them rage, Will added, closing the folder. This place is yours now. In every way. She nodded, folded the legal pad, and slid it back into the drawer next to the stamped mail and dog-eared seed catalog. That night, Delia threw what she called a quiet freedom dinner. Nothing formal, just the two of them, a roast chicken, potatoes, and a bottle of chilled white wine that had been waiting in Delia's fridge since the court dismissed the petition. Maggie set the table with cloth napkins, not out of ceremony, just care. Delia raised her glass halfway through the meal. To freedom that doesn't need a declaration, Maggie tapped hers gently against it. To silence that feels earned. They didn't toast loudly, just drank and let the peace of it settle in like good lighting. As the sun dipped low over the edge of the porch, Chloe stopped by with a package under her arm. I wanted to drop this off before school eats my life, she said, handing it over. I got an A, by the way. Maggie opened it carefully. Inside was a framed version of Chloe's civics project. A 3-page profile printed on cream cardstock, the title etched in deliberate block letters. When Service Doesn't Shout, The Life of Maggie Vance. Maggie traced a fingertip along the edge of the frame. You spelled my name right. Chloe grinned. Spell check. And respect. She left with a quick hug and a promise to stop by after midterms. Maggie hung the frame in the hallway just across from the linen closet, where the morning light would hit it and make it visible from the front door. Not a centerpiece. A reminder. The hallway had always been cluttered. Mail, boxes, things meant to go upstairs. Now it was clear. The wall was clean, and on it hung a story that told more truth than any family photo ever had. Later that evening, as she washed the last of the dinner dishes, her phone buzzed. It was Bryce. She dried her hands slowly, letting the towel rest across her palm before picking it up. Don't expect calls on holidays. 7 words. Cold, final. Like a lock snapping shut from the other side. Maggie read it once, then set the phone face down on the counter. She didn't delete it this time. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch with her tea and sat in the chair. Hank used to oil every spring. The wood creaked but held. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked out at the yard, now lit with motion sensors and ringed by growing plants. There was no storm left, just weather, and the house, still standing. The quiet that woke Maggie wasn't hollow. It wasn't the echoing stillness of grief or the tense quiet of waiting for a phone to ring. It wasn't even the uneasy hush that used to creep into the corners of the house after Hank's diagnosis, when each silence held a question she was afraid to ask. This silence felt different. It felt clean. She lay in bed for a moment, watching the faint light shift against the ceiling. The wind moved gently through the trees outside, and the old wood of the house creaked like it always had. But none of it felt intrusive. It was just the sound of something still standing. She got up slowly. No rush, no obligation, no list waiting for her on the fridge in Hank's handwriting. She baked biscuits that morning, not the frozen kind, real ones, with buttermilk and flour sifted twice. The old way. She didn't bother with sausage or eggs. Just butter and a spoonful of honey on the side. She sat at the table alone, the sun cutting across the wood in stripes. She took a bite and let herself enjoy it. Every flaky layer, every slow chew. No distractions, no calculations, just breakfast. Later, Delia came by with a tape measure and the kind of expression that meant she'd been planning something for weeks. "I'm not saying your layout's bad," she said, eyeing the living room, "but it could breathe better." "You're rearranging my life now?" Maggie asked, bemused. "Nope, just your couch." They moved things slowly, sliding furniture across the floors with blankets under the legs to keep the wood from scuffing. The sofa ended up angled toward the window, where the afternoon light pooled like warm water. The bookshelf rotated. The coffee table got banished altogether, too clunky. In its place, a braided rug Delia had brought from her own garage, rolled up since her divorce, and finally ready to belong to someone new. By the time they were done, the space looked lighter, not younger, not trendier, just awake. That evening, after Delia left with her empty coffee mug and a satisfied grin, Maggie opened the drawer in the hallway desk and pulled out her journal. It wasn't fancy, just a black composition notebook, the kind students still used. Inside, her handwriting filled most pages, half reflections, half grocery lists, and the occasional line that might have made a decent poem if she hadn't crossed it out. She flipped to a fresh page, uncapped her pen, and wrote slowly. He'd be proud, not of the donations, not of the headline, but of the refusal, to be owned, to be small, to let grief turn into apology. She paused, reread it, then underlined refusal once. The window in the kitchen was open now. The air coming through was warm, but carried just enough breeze to make the curtains move, not frantically, just gently, like the house was exhaling. Maggie stood in the doorway between kitchen and living room, barefoot, arms folded. The house didn't feel different because she'd changed the furniture. It felt different because no one was waiting to take anything from it. No one hovering over her shoulder, measuring what they'd been denied. No one shaping her memory of Hank into something transactional. This wasn't the quiet of isolation. It was the quiet of ownership. Not of assets, not of property, of self. The ground was softer than she expected. Maggie knelt near the back fence, the spring soil dark and damp under her gloves. She'd marked the spot the night before with a small stone, pacing the yard until the position felt right. Not too close to the garden, not lost under the maple's shade. Enough room to grow, enough room to breathe. She lowered the sapling into the hole, a young white oak, slender but steady, its roots wrapped in burlap. The nursery clerk had told her it was the kind that would hold its leaves late into winter, clinging until the new ones pushed them off. She liked that. It felt honest. Delia stood beside her, one hand on her hip, the other shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "You sure you don't want help?" "I've got it," Maggie said. She pressed the soil in around the trunk, packing it tight, her hands sure and slow. When she was done, she brushed the dirt from her knees and reached for the small bronze plaque resting beside her. The engraving was simple: Hank Caldwell, in service and silence. She set it in the ground at the base of the tree, just where the light caught it but didn't glare. Then she stood back, wiping her palms on her jeans, and let the moment settle. Delia didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just came to stand beside Maggie, close enough that their sleeves brushed, both women watching the sapling tilt slightly in the breeze before straightening again. "He'd have liked that one," Delia said finally. Maggie nodded. "It'll do." That evening, Maggie cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just baked chicken and roasted carrots. The kind Hank used to like when he wanted something that didn't talk back. The oven hummed, the kitchen filled with the kind of warmth that didn't need company to feel full. After she ate, she washed each dish by hand, one by one. The last plate squeaked against the towel, clean and warm. She set it in the rack, turned off the light, and let the faint hum of the refrigerator fill the room. On the counter sat Hank's old journal. The leather cover was cracked at the corners, the binding soft from years of use. She opened it to the very last page. The handwriting there was his, faint but legible. Half a grocery list, half a note to himself about replacing the fence post that still hadn't rotted through when he passed. She took her pen and wrote beneath it. "They never understood, but I did." She capped the pen, closed the journal, and left it open-faced on the counter, the way Hank used to leave things for her to find. Later, she stepped out to the back porch. The air was cool, the kind that carried just enough damp to smell like earth. The new oak stood straight against the horizon, its leaves trembling in the quiet. The small bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the porch light. Maggie leaned against the railing, mug of tea warming her hands. She didn't think of the arguments anymore, or the texts, or the court filings with her name in bold at the top. None of it seemed to belong to her now. The house behind her glowed soft through the windows, gold light against pale walls. It wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. She breathed in, slow and even, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time in months. The silence wasn't absence, it was ownership. It was peace. When my husband passed, my sons argued over who'd take what from the property. They stopped arguing when they learned I'd already donated it all in his name.